everyone, and welcome to this edition of UCalgary's webinar series, where we will discuss the upcoming COP26 Summit, the 2021 United Nations Conference on Climate Change. If you've participated in one of our previous webinars, welcome back. And to all of our new viewers, thanks for joining us. I'm Chancellor Deborah Yedlin, and I'll be your moderator today. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that we're recording this webinar on the traditional territories of the people of the Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta, which includes the Blackfoot Confederacy comprising the Siksika, Piikani, and Kainai First Nations, as well as the Tsuut'ina First Nation and the Stoney Nakoda, including the Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Wesley First Nations. The city of Calgary is also home to Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3. We started this webinar series at the onset of the pandemic to inform and support our community members by connecting them with COVID-related research and resources. But since then, we've expanded our focus to include a wider variety of webinar topics, but our purpose is still the same: to share and discuss knowledge and insight from UCalgary experts with our community. Together, we can use research and facts to take on the challenges that face us. Today, I'm joined by a panel of distinguished guests who will discuss the importance of priorities of the forthcoming COP26. If you're wondering, COP26 stands for Conference of Parties, and this marks the 26th event. It is a global United Nations summit about climate change and how countries are planning to commit to urgent global climate action. COP26 is significant as it will be the first summit to take place after the Paris Agreement measures take effect, and we will see nations come together to review their commitments. It will demonstrate the urgency and the opportunities towards a net zero carbon future and the power of international cooperation to address climate action. You may wonder what they need to achieve at COP26. Well, let's find out about the 4 goals that have been set. We'll play a short video.
The climate crisis is a clear and present danger for us all. We must act now. We must make COP26 the turning point. To do this, there are 4 goals we need to achieve. 1. Secure global net zero and keep 1.5 degrees within reach. 2. Adapt to protect communities and natural habitats. 3. Mobilize finance. 4. Deliver global collaboration to accelerate climate action. At COP26, the world will come together to recover cleaner, to rebuild greener, and restore our planet.
The world faces an existential challenge of climate change. And climate change is fundamentally an energy challenge that touches us at every aspect of society. The need to sustainably and aggressively reduce our energy systems, emissions intensity, and overall emissions motivates a new era of energy research, programming, partnerships, and collaborations at the University of Calgary. We are leading the energy transformation. Calgary has always been Canada's energy capital, and our university is committed to the title, Never Leaving Town. We've done groundbreaking work in today's energy, and to a large extent, graduates from UCalgary have helped the energy sector flourish, just as it will help us transform the energy sector. We're doing groundbreaking work in the energy of tomorrow, like extracting hydrogen from oil and gas and using it as a carbon-free fuel. In fact, we have more than 300 scholars from a host of disciplines: engineering, chemistry, geology, policy, economics, and more. But we're not only active in reducing emissions, we're active in capturing them. Someone shared information about a company called Carbon Engineering. It's developed some of the most exciting technology to capture carbon anywhere in the world. And you know where it came from? The University of Calgary. But capturing carbon is only half the battle. You need to store it too. And there's a facility near Brooks that's also a world leader, because it doesn't just store carbon dioxide. It uses new technology to track and monitor the methane while it's in storage, so it never bubbles up. That grew from the University of Calgary too. So let's take a quick look of the CMC Containment and Monitoring Institute Field Research Station, a research site for development and validation of technologies to verify containment and conformance of stored carbon dioxide. Please show us the video.
Carbon Management Canada, in collaboration with the University of Calgary, has developed the field research station in southern Alberta. Innovators and industries from all around the world work here to evaluate the performance of different technology that will monitor and track carbon dioxide and methane as it moves underground or in the atmosphere. Hi everyone, my name is Marie Maquet. I'm a geophysicist working at CMC, Carbon Management Canada. Welcome to the field research station. Here we are injecting a small volume of CO2 at shallow depths. So far we have injected 40 tons at 300 meter depths. The goal of the field is to test and develop technology that will ensure CCS monitoring and verification.
They're doing a great job working with some of the modern technology, and I know Dr. Lawton, who has joined us today, will be able to talk about that more shortly. And that's a perfect segue for me to introduce to you our three distinguished panelists. Jonathan Turner, British Consul-General for Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba. Anna-Marie Hubert, Assistant Professor in the Faculty of Law at the University of Calgary. And Dr. Don Lawton, Professor Emeritus of Geophysics, University of Calgary, and Director of Carbon Management Canada's Containment and Monitoring Institute. Now, throughout the discussion, we encourage audience members to submit comments at any time during the conversation using the Q&A feature at the bottom of the screen. And for this webinar, we've received a number of video questions that we will share as time allows. But we're going to start with a conversation about COP26, why it's taking place in the UK, and what the UK expects to gain as it hosts this conference and the example that it expects to showcase to the rest of the world. So we'll start with Jonathan Turner, and he will tell us a bit more about the UK's role in hosting COP26.
Many thanks, Chancellor, to be here. I thought maybe I'd start off by just giving a little bit of the context as well. Of course, it's been covered in the introduction, but I think I'll just elaborate a little bit. We can see the clear benefits of tackling climate change, and I think it's of interest to all of us to look at it in terms of cleaner air, healthier communities, sustainable economic growth, energy security, and safer and stable climate. From our perspective, we see a green and resilient recovery from COVID-19 as a way of creating employment in industries of the future, and the opportunity to develop green, inclusive and resilient recovery plans that deliver for the planet and for the economy. We also see it as the most significant economic opportunity of the 21st century. The costs of renewables and lower carbon technology have fallen far more than we anticipated. Solar and wind are already cheaper than coal power in 2/3 of the world and are predicted to undercut commissioned coal and gas almost everywhere by 2030. But to meet the Paris Agreement goals, we need to decarbonize the global economy 3 or 5 times faster than we did over the last 2 decades. So we need a step change both in building resilience as well. So the UK is also committed to thinking about how we do this for the most vulnerable people who are on the front line of climate change, and that's really important for COP26, which I'll come on to in a minute. The conference itself is the biggest conference that we've ever held in the UK. It's being held in Glasgow at the beginning of November. Our responsibility as the UK is to provide leadership and to help negotiate the process. So we act as an honest broker, representing the interests of all the parties and ensuring an ambitious, comprehensive and balanced outcome that leaves no issues left behind. As I mentioned before, we're looking at how we can bring in governments, business, civil society and Indigenous peoples to drive action across the economy to reduce emissions, mobilise finance, adapt and build resilience to the effects of climate change, and to make real progress in the largest emitting sectors of power, road transport and land use. So just to give a little bit of an overview, sort of unpacking our short video that we have four main areas that we want to focus on for our COP26 presidency: one on mitigation, one on adaptation, one on finance, and one on collaboration. So taking each of them in turn, in terms of mitigation, we're looking to secure global net zero and keep to our 1.5 degrees target, which was made at the Paris Agreement. So to do that, we need to encourage net zero commitments by the middle of the century, including delivering through long-term strategies. We also need to enhance our 2030 national emissions reduction targets. These are known as nationally determined contributions, or NDCs. One of the other areas that we're looking at is how to phase out coal, encourage investment into renewables, and halt fossil fuel subsidies, as well as picking up the pace of electric vehicle rollout. In terms of our second core goal on adaptation, this is about how we urgently adapt to protect communities and natural habitats. So we want to enable and encourage countries that are affected by climate change to build defences, global warning systems and resilient infrastructure to avoid losses of homes and livelihoods. On our third goal of mobilising finance, this is a really, really important one, and we want to make good on the $100 billion annual climate finance goal that was affirmed at the Paris Agreement. We see that as a way to really unleash trillions of dollars in private and public finance to really help meet this global net zero target. And finally, collaboration, which is of course the topic of this conversation. We see we need to work together to accelerate action, and to do that we need to close off some of the outstanding elements of the Paris rulebook, and look at how we can deliver the goals through collaboration between governments, business and civil society. So yeah, that's a sort of a quick overview of our objectives from the UK in terms of the COP26, but really happy to be here and look forward to the conversation. Thank you.
So one of the items you touched on, of course, is this imperative to get to net zero, and I think we could level set what that exactly means, because I think people talk about net zero. We've heard the major oil sands companies in Canada coming together to announce their pathways to net zero. Dr. Lawton, what does this actually mean? What are the mechanics of getting to net zero?
Thank you, Chancellor Yedlin. Yeah, so we hear often this term net zero by 2050, and essentially net zero means that we're not contributing any CO2 into the atmosphere. So whatever we emit into the atmosphere, we either have to take out or we have to avoid putting it in the atmosphere in the first place. And I do have a graphic that's relevant to Canada, but actually it's applicable essentially everywhere on how we can sort of look at this visually. So if we could bring up the slide on the mitigations. So this is the example from Canada. This is our emissions for CO2 over the past 20 years. And you see they've actually been quite level since about 2004, mostly due to increases in energy efficiency. But the goal we have by 2050 is to follow the green dashed line to zero emissions. To get there, it's not going to be easy, but there's pathways that are described by these colored wedges. And if we look at the horizontal red dashed line, which goes to the right-hand end of the display, that is basically telling us business as usual if we continue to do the same. But what we need to do, at least, is the trajectory of the dashed red line below the colored wedges. And each of those wedges is really a technology that enables us to reduce the emissions that we currently are emitting into the atmosphere. And we can, as Consul Turner mentioned, electrification. We're now looking here at the investment in hydrogen. This whether it be so-called blue or green, bioenergy, increase in renewables, and this technology that we're pioneering, particularly here in Western Canada, carbon capture, utilization, storage, or CCUS, sometimes just called the storage side, CCS. That can make a difference. And interestingly, the video you just showed of our field site has a great collaboration with the UK. We had researchers from University of Bristol and Oxford actually on site with us last week, looking at how we can monitor for ensuring that CO2 that we place underground stays there. But that's not the end of the story, because the red dashed line doesn't actually get us to zero. There are these so-called unavoidable emissions that we need to deal with. So in order to get to that green dashed line, we have to introduce what are called negative emissions. And these are where we're actually extract CO2 out of the atmosphere. So not stopping emitting, but actually reducing the amount of CO2 in the air. And you mentioned Carbon Engineering. That is a company that is leading what's called direct air capture, or CDR, carbon dioxide removal. So net zero really means that we are contributing no CO2 into the atmosphere. And the technologies that are being developed now to get us there will have to grow rapidly over the next 25 years. And that's really the innovation and deployment will come into being. The colored wedges are things we're doing already, and these can be done. So it's the short and long-term goals to get to so-called net zero. So I hope that gives a definition of what that means and what graphically it looks like. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Lawton. So I think one of the pieces that's missing from your graph is the finance piece in terms of how the market will work for companies to buy offsets, because technology, as we know, deploying technology is one way of dealing with the carbon emissions issue. But the other piece that we know is going to be part of the toolkit is going to be companies buying emissions, buying offsets. So I'm wondering if either of Jonathan or Anna Maria could talk to us about the offset market and what that looks like in terms of achieving the net zero goals outside the actual scientific issues that we have to address. Jonathan.
Yeah, thank you, Chancellor. I mean, I think this is one of the really live issues for the COP26 is resolving this issue on Article 6. As you mentioned, the way of trading on this will really help to raise climate ambition and lower costs, as well as engaging the private sector and spreading some of the finance and technology across. So it's a really important issue. I mean, I think from the UK's perspective, we're hopeful that we can facilitate a good agreement. Of course, we are here as an honest broker in the negotiations, trying to bring everyone together to facilitate a resolution in terms of how we can make an agreement on Article 6, because it's such a sort of tricky and complicated matter, but one that's just so important in terms of raising that ambition and raising the ability to reduce carbon. So that's probably all I can say from the negotiations perspective.
Sure. Anna Maria, can you speak to Article 6 and the challenges and its importance?
Yeah, so Article 6 basically provides for international mechanism for international cooperation on carbon markets and also on non-market approaches. And it's been, so if we consider a Paris Agreement, the negotiation and adoption of Paris was considered the biggest diplomatic achievement maybe that we've seen in the modern world. The issue now is that we're trying to find rules and mechanisms and procedures for implementing this very complex agreement. And so part of this devising what's called the Paris Rule Book is coming to agreement on things like carbon markets. And so some of the issues are, how can we design a coherent, transparent framework for trading? One of the big issues is double counting, so that emissions taken down in one area don't also get counted in another area, and therefore we don't have the climate effects or the counting that we need to reach the Paris climate goals. And so the quality of the rules will dictate whether there's a lot of potential in these market mechanisms, but the quality of the rules will determine to a large extent whether they're effective or not. I think part of the issue too is, for example, we can develop and share technologies, but I think when we look back at the graph, there's a similar graph for what the world needs to do to get to net zero, and part of that graph, a big part, is negative emissions. There are certain industries that are difficult to decarbonize. And so we put these into the models, but we actually haven't developed the technological means to actually reduce or remove emissions from the atmosphere using negative emissions technologies or carbon dioxide removal. And so, so yes, we need to finance technology, but we also need to put a lot of money in finance innovation at the front end. And Canada, in cooperation, and the UK has done a lot on negative emissions technology, or is one of the front runners in the world. And there's opportunities for institutions like ours to develop programs and to collaborate and to seek funding for developing these technologies in a responsible way.
So, you've mentioned a few times, and so has Jonathan, just, finance, it's money. It's going to cost money in terms of how do we get there? And I guess the question is, Professor Lawton, you're right in the middle of it. You've got the CMC, and when you look at the needs for further financing, where do you see those sources of financing coming from, and how important is it to continue to scale your operations?
Well, it's incredibly important to scale. If you look at the goal we have, we're currently emitting about 35 billion tons of CO2 per year into the atmosphere. So we need every means possible to reduce those emissions. So there's no single technology that can answer it. So all of them need to be, every possible idea we have needs to be scaled. Some ideas are more scalable than others, and certainly CCS is scalable right now. There's still an expense. So ultimately society, and this I think where the discussion about integrating governments, the public, and tech and industry needs to come to be discussed, and that there is a cost to doing it, and we're applying the technologies, we're reducing the costs of those technologies, but they'll never go to zero.
So when you look at when you look at the array of what's being developed right now, from carbon capture and storage to hydrogen, blue and green, to geothermal, to direct air capture, can you rank them in terms of what's most likely to really do the most in terms of capturing carbon relative to the cost, and where we should be focusing our dollars, so to speak, to get the biggest return in terms of capturing emissions and decreasing emissions, I guess?
Well, certainly carbon capture and storage is an immediate technology we can implement now. We could get to a gigaton scale. That's what the community is looking at. But the nature-based solutions also contribute significantly, and that's what we haven't touched on yet at this point. That's really a timescale issue as well. But ultimately, we have to get to, as Anna Maria said, removal of CO2 from the atmosphere. That's still probably the most expensive part. The technologies are still in their infancy, but that's where we need the investment to get to negative emissions, to get to net zero.
Anna Maria, you wanted to weigh in.
Yeah, and I would add that we can look at costs more broadly than just the expense to develop and finance, but also I think especially when we talk about negative emissions technologies and the proposals that are on the table, there are all sorts of trade-offs, especially once you scale them up, that come with these technologies. And so in terms of environmental sustainability, land use, and food security, and so forth. And so I think it's useful to not just think of these technologies in terms of what we can achieve in terms of climate effects, but also sort of broader considerations of environmental sustainability, equity, and justice. And so we need better frameworks to develop and consider these in the mix. And it's also a reason to, I think, be somewhat skeptical about claims by oil companies that they plan to use and rely on some of these technologies, because there are trade-offs with fossil fuels, and then adding removals to the mixes, it could be potentially even more damaging. So
there's no such thing as a zero-sum game. We learned that in physics, right? For every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. That's that much I remember from my physics classes. But Jonathan, you talked about. Yes, go ahead.
Well, I just had one quick comment about the cost. I think we always have to think about the costs of applying the technologies or the emissions reductions versus the ultimate cost of doing nothing.
Right.
And I think that's a key thing to keep in the back of our minds.
And Jonathan, I wanted to just sort of end this part of the webinar with throwing to you on that issue. You talked about a sustainable model that results in a green economic recovery. So it's the costs being addressed, but also invested, but also making sure that we achieve sustainable solutions. So I just wanted to talk about how this is actually an economic argument as much as it is an environmental argument.
Yeah, absolutely, and that's very much the way that we see it in the UK as well. I mean, just to pick up on Dr. Lawton's point, we've seen studies that show that for every $1 spent on energy transition, you can get a benefit of between $3 and $7 US from savings from health, climate, and subsidies. And of course, as you mentioned in your intro remarks, the recent IFCC report saying the impact of climate has really become stark, and I think it's really opened up a lot of people's eyes into the sort of imminent impact that this is going to have, and the fact that the counterfactual isn't do nothing, because that's going to have an extreme cost in itself.
And when you look at it from the perspective, I mean, the UK has really been leading from the perspective of green bonds and green finance. Can you talk a little bit more about how that market's grown and what kind of government support has been necessary for that market to really grow?
Yeah, I mean, I think the financing element and private financing element is so important, and being able to deploy those huge resources into green technology and into green is really important. I think what we've done in the UK is tried to develop some of the systems, as well as some of the ways of measuring and building these markets, to give certainty to businesses and other investors as well, that they can invest in that, and setting up things like green bonds and some of the ways in which we can provide that information to prospective investors has been really important. And we've seen that market increase massively over the last decade or so, probably less time than that, and we've seen the results for ourselves in relation to the costs reducing on some of our renewables in the UK, and the investments that are being made, including from companies that are based in Alberta, that are investing quite heavily into the UK, into the renewables sector.
Well, thank you. We're going to now turn it over to a different segment of our webinar, and it really will center on video questions that have been submitted by people from around the world, actually. And there's 12 of them, and we're going to start with the first one. That's from a young lad named Owen.
Hi, I'm Owen and I'm 10. I was wondering, where does all the carbon we release go?
Professor Lawton, I think that one's for you.
Thank you, Chancellor. Yes, well, it's a very good question from Owen. So CO2 goes into a whole range of different outcomes. Now, the one we talk about the most is release into the atmosphere, but it's also absorbed by the oceans. It's absorbed by trees and forests. So it goes into a whole range of outcomes that are both good and not so good. So we're focused really here on how do we prevent that component that goes into the atmosphere and ultimately then into the oceans. So that's really where it all goes.
Thank you. The next question.
Hi, this is Kim from Calgary, and I believe this question is for Dr. Lawton. What happens to all the CO2 that's stored over the centuries? And are there any federal incentives or regulations in Canada to drive this initiative?
Yes, excellent question on that. In Canada, I'll start with the incentives first. Canada is looking in 2022 to bring in what are called ITCs, or incentive tax credits, to encourage industry to store carbon underground or to mitigate it in other ways. So once it's underground, we want to ensure that we place it in places where it will not leak out. So the rule is, or the goal is, to have it guaranteed to be stored indefinitely. So we are very careful using geoscience and engineering to ensure that we inject the CO2 underground into places where it will not leak out and it's permanently stored. So that's really a key requirement of that particular technology.
And we also, Alberta has some of the best geology in the world for storing carbon. Is that correct?
That's correct. In Western Canada, if you think of Western Manitoba right through to western part of Alberta, we have the capacity to store upwards of 400 billion tons of CO2 very safely in the rocks that are below us here in the province. And in the UK, the North Sea is being identified as having very large resources as well for storage.
Yeah, that would be the Sleipner field. I mean, that's been going on for quite a while now.
Yes, yeah, but others in the British part, they're looking at a number of projects there now for large-scale storage.
I just want to ask Anne-Maria to weigh in on this too, from a government incentive or regulatory perspective, if you have anything to add in terms of what we need to be seeing or what's already in place to encourage this.
I mean, it's definitely useful to have a price on carbon dioxide that, or carbon pollution as it's called. So the federal scheme definitely helps to fuel new kinds of innovations and measures within the economy. So getting rid of that externality where you can just emit without a cost is a good first step, and increasing the price over time would help as well, especially when we talk about technologies that are more expensive, like removal technologies down the line.
And should the sort of, Professor Lawton mentioned investment tax credits. The US has something called the 45Q. Is it critical to have some sort of mechanism like that in order for us to foster the growth of this carbon capture opportunity? That's for you or for Jonathan or for Dr. Lawton.
Well, I can just talk about what's happening as a result of the announcement that the numbers of companies here in Western Canada becoming very interested in carbon dioxide storage has increased very rapidly with the announcements from Natural Resources Canada about, and also from the province of Alberta about opportunities here.
I can add something just additional from the UK perspective, if that's helpful. Just about the sort of hub model that we've taken in the UK around CCUS, and I think that's one of the real opportunities, is to support the development of different business models for emerging technologies, and to support the sort of industrial hub centres, looking for a way of reducing costs, and of course using some of the existing advantages that you have, if it's the geological storage which we've talked about, or existing pipelines, or of course a high concentration of emitters, so that you're able to bring all those together. And we've seen that that's been working really well in the UK through these hubs, and I think that's something, of course, in my time since I've arrived in Alberta, I've seen with lots of announcements around the hubs in Edmonton in particular.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, correct. We'll go to the next video, the next question from Sean.
Hello, I'm Sean from Spruce Grove, Alberta. This year, Canada's largest oil sands producers announced an unprecedented alliance to achieve net zero greenhouse gas emissions. What will be the impact of this collaboration?
So Jonathan, I'm going to throw that back to you, because the oil sands producers have had a lot of challenges overseas, particularly in the UK. They've had issues with insurers saying that they don't want to continue insurance. Investors have had lots of questions. So you have a very unique lens in terms of what this announcement could mean. Will it be enough to get the attention positively from the UK, from companies, from investors, and from the banks and the insurers?
Yeah, thank you, Chancellor. I mean, I think the announcement was made in my first few weeks here, and I think everyone I've spoken to has been extremely positive about the fact that the 5 big oil and gas companies here have been able to reach this agreement. And as far as I understand, it's a pretty unusual one. So I think there's a lot of positive news there, and from the UK perspective, I think where businesses can show the tangible approach that they're taking to get to net zero is really important for investors and for businesses when they're thinking about be it provinces or individual businesses. And of course, our financial system in the UK, which is of course a global financial system, is really starting to think about that, and has for a number of years. It's such a big consideration now that I think for businesses that can show that they've got a tangible approach to reaching net zero, that's so important. And that's one of the things that we're doing actually as part of the run up to COP26, is the race to zero, and looking at where we can encourage companies and get companies to make those commitments and do that signaling mechanism to show that they have a plan. Of course, the devil's always in the detail with these things, and it's all subject to being able to get the right investments in there, the right subsidies, probably to some extent, as well as doing it on the sort of really ambitious timelines.
Dr. Lawton, I mean, this is, you've lived in this world of energy and oil sands for a long time. I'm just curious as to what you think the impact of this collaboration will be.
Well, I think it's going to be really a step forward, but it's going to be a difficult path. I think that's just what is being discussed currently. I think as to how to get there. There's lots of claims to get to net zero, but the detailed pathways to get there are still not that clear.
We had success with Aostra many years ago, so maybe we're hoping that we'll see the same kind of success on this one.
Yeah, so certainly there are plans that are being evolved. Certainly on the storage side, the developments there, I think, will help get them there.
So we have a question now from somebody overseas. So let's have that video.
I'm Melania from New Zealand. If we have to reduce by 400 megatons of CO2 a year, what does that mean? Help me understand what the big number really means and how we'll get there. Also, there would be a big cost to do that. What does that look like?
Well, I think, Professor Lawton, it's back to your graph and perhaps more conversation around that. And then after, I'd like to ask Jonathan to talk about it from a finance standpoint and the cost.
Sure. Well, I think I mean the number is actually much bigger than 400 megatons. Maybe that was for New Zealand, which incidentally was where I came from originally. But yes, it's really, as I mentioned earlier, there's no single technology that we can use to get there. We need all of those wedges that we showed in that initial graphic. So we can get there, but it's just a matter of implementing them as quickly as possible and upscaling those that can be.
Jonathan,
yes,
from a finance standpoint, cost?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a few ways of looking at this. Of course, from the COP26 perspective, we're looking at how we can increase to 100 billion annually investment, and I think that's a combination of the private sector as well as the public sector, and being able to drive down some of the costs in generation in particular, and I think we've seen that happen quite significantly. I think the stats are pretty stark in relation to the reductions in the cost of power generation. Say for solar, I think it's reduced by about 80%, and offshore wind by about 29%, I think, for offshore wind. So there's some good indications there. I mean, I think one of the other challenges that always comes up in this space is the cost around coal as well, and existing coal plants. What we're seeing is that the likely cost of running existing plants is going to be higher in the future than building new renewables. So making that switch to renewables is important, and one of the reasons why that's important on the financial sector side is around stranded assets as well, and the way that those are accounted for. And the financial system, I think, is really becoming quite attuned to making those assessments around what's the climate risk. And our central bank has also started to do quite a lot of that in relation to doing risk testing of businesses and banks in terms of climate impact. So that is a sort of incentive mechanism to make the change and make the move. So again, I think it all comes down to that counterfactual of what is the alternative, and I think we're starting to see some of the stark economic impacts of that. So being able to deploy the finances and being able to drive down the cost of renewable energies is so important. And from the UK perspective, the financial services sector is really looking at how they can do that, and there's a strong drive from pension funds and other big institutional investors to do that.
Well, and the G7 also came out with its commitment to disclosure, to having banks and financial and insurance companies disclose their exposure to climate-related, and their climate-related risks. So this is not going away.
Exactly. I think it's only going one direction. So better to be ahead of the curve.
Yes, that's always the goal, to be ahead of the curve. Our next question is from Juan from Lethbridge.
Hey, Jan here from Lethbridge. I just had a question. How do we reconcile the short-term market mentality of investors to the longer-term gains that need to be made in aggressive climate change? Thanks.
That's a great question. Because it's long-term gains, but short-term market mentality. I think, Jonathan, I'll put you on the spot there, and we'll go to Anna Maria, and then Professor Lawton, because he understands that research process and how long it takes. So, Jonathan, the markets, long-term versus short-term.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, just thank you. Yeah, I mean, just a sort of quick word following up from the last question. I mean, I think it's the markets are changing and have changed quite substantially because of some of these requirements that are coming in, and some of the need to understand the climate impact and be able to account for that as a business and what the impact is on a business. So I think that will change the mindset in terms of business approaches. And of course, you have these big market moving investors that are really pushing quite strongly for some of the green credentials. So I think that's really important. And then, of course, bringing that back to the COP26 is again how we can use the financing, the $100 billion dollars a year figure to try and help deploy that. And I know there's a lot of work going on in that space. Canada and Germany leading a financial task force to look at how to deliver some of that.
Anna Maria, how do you see this sort of apparent disconnect between the long-term goals and the short-term markets?
Yeah, I mean, well, the sort of long-term impacts of climate change are getting closer and closer. So we've started to see some really tough summers here in terms of heat waves and forest fires and other kinds of climate impacts. And it's only going to get worse. And so the slower we are to implement climate action, the greater the cost will be down the road to us, and especially to those most vulnerable in the world, because some of us, I think we're all in the UK and Canada, we have the means, we're wealthy and have the means to adapt in particular ways. I think this is also a question of law and governance. And so one of the issues that is often pointed out is we have these short 5-year or less election cycles, and this can be very disruptive to long-term climate policy and goals. And so Canada's recently, the Liberal government has introduced at the federal level this Net Zero Emissions Accountability Act, which draws upon some of the successes that have been achieved in the UK, which would legislate Canada's net zero target. The UK has done this already. And so requiring these 5-year national emissions targets, justifications, transparency, accountability, to the extent that this framework could be resilient and last across different governments, is a good step. So there are things that we can do, such as through legislation, but
yeah, no, I think it's better a 5-year election cycle than a quarterly reporting cycle in terms of short-term and long-term. That's where the markets are. Don, do you have anything to add in terms of the scientific process relative to what the markets are expecting?
Well, I think what's critical is really the long-term versus short-term capability of the technologies. And certainly, U of Calgary has a very strong team on life cycle analysis and techno-economic assessment. So if we look at very short time scale for technology development, and therefore also perhaps investments, then perhaps that needs to be looked at in terms of the total technology picture over time to ensure that it is contributing to reducing emissions and is not just seen as greenwashing.
Right, that's important. We'll go to our next question, please.
Hi, my name is Adeline. There are 8.7 million species on the Earth and 1 million are facing extinction. What can the world leaders at COP26 do to help those species?
Dawn, I think that's yours.
Well, I think it's well, I'll basically hand over to maybe Anna Maria. I think she's wanted to say something.
All right.
And Adeline, this is something that I'm also concerned about, and there's an interesting relationship between biodiversity and climate. And so on the one hand, it's really important that countries, when they gather in Glasgow this November, set ambitious climate targets and that they implement them so that we can avoid large temperature increases this century and beyond. Because these big temperature changes are not just hard on human communities, but also different species and ecosystems. For example, we saw on the West Coast with this big heat wave this summer that this had a huge impact on marine life, such as shellfish and so forth. So it's really important that we take climate action, and that's linked to preventing harm to biodiversity. At the same time, some of the measures that we take on climate can also adversely or harm biodiversity. So it's really also seeing climate action, such as planting trees, if they're done in huge swaths as monoculture, can really disrupt ecosystems. And so it's important that we also consider the ways in which climate measures impact biodiversity. But that's a great question, thank you. And I would say that it's not just countries working in the area of climate that are thinking about these questions, but there's a new agenda being developed at the international level by countries on biodiversity, and these go hand in hand.
Thanks, Anna Maria. Jonathan? Yeah.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Sorry, just to add in specifically COP26, there's a number of theme days that are being held over the 2 weeks. There's about 7 in total, and one of them is on nature, and that's going to be running alongside the formal negotiations, which are the sort of heart of the summit. But what we want to do from that perspective is to drive momentum and showcase some of the progress and the commitments that have been made on the nature campaign. And this is all about the ecosystem protection, restoration, and transition to a sustainable production and consumption for humanity. It's one of the opportunities that we're specifically looking at, or the UK specifically looking at for COP26.
Thank you. Let's have our next question from Texas.
Hi, I'm Steven from Texas. This year, this world has seen hot temperatures, forest fires, and myself, I was in the Texas snowpocalypse. These are great climate events. Does this push for a greater sense of urgency?
Who would like to take that? Anna Maria, Jonathan, Dr. Lawton? Greater sense of urgency?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I mean, it depends on where you live and what the conversation is like. But I mean, for me, yes, this summer was kind of challenging in Western Canada and other places around the world. And we're seeing these extreme weather events and other kinds of climate impacts really starting to have a human toll beyond what we might have even imagined when we started having this conversation, back in the late 80s, seriously. And so yeah, I think we see, for example, in our federal election here, a lot more discussion of climate change policy and issues and how this relates to the economy and so forth. So I think it certainly will.
Yeah, I think also the discussion has now moved beyond isolated weather events towards more of the climate change, and that the metric on this is the insurance payouts. I mean, you can see very clearly the impact of climate change on weather systems.
Yeah.
Maybe just to add, I alluded to it before, but the IPCC report that came out in August, which was sort of right at the time we were seeing some of these big forest fires and things like that. I think that report was pretty stark in relation to the impact humans are having on climate change, and the conclusion of the report's authors was that there's no doubt that human activity is warming the planet, and that the world is on course to pass the 1.5 degrees threshold within the next 2 decades, and that this is going to have both a impact in terms of worsening the most extreme events as well as happening across all of the regions. I think that probably has been brought into focus a little bit more recently with the forest fires and the other sort of extreme events. Traditionally, I think people have seen climate change happening elsewhere, but when you see it happening in your backyard, then it really, I think, focuses minds.
Yeah, in your backyard, not far away from where you work and live. Yeah, Anna Maria?
Exactly.
Yeah, I would just add that it's not just our backyard that we need to think about, but also the backyards of those most vulnerable who largely haven't been responsible for creating this problem and have reduced capacities to address it. So those in less developed countries. And so one of the important conversations that will take place at COP26 relates to climate finance and loss and damage and so forth. And so these are really important in terms of questions of climate justice and not within our own backyards, but elsewhere, and what we can do to help others.
It's a very good point. So our next question is actually from Calgary.
Hi, Cindy from Calgary. During the pandemic, we saw less vehicles on the road, and we've seen the city actually move rather quickly on different initiatives. So I'm specifically thinking about the lane closures on Memorial Drive that gave cyclists and pedestrians more space and room to move. Those would have some obvious benefits on the environment, but could you get into more specifics on that?
Professor Lawton, you're up.
Well, I think it's a great idea. We should do it more. I think the less we rely on individuals driving fuel vehicles around is beneficial. I don't at my fingertips have what the impact of that would be on reductions, but it's, as I said before, we need all arrows in the quiver to get where we need to be.
Jonathan, I know you're a cyclist. Why don't you talk about commuting on a bicycle?
Yeah, thank you. I've been pleasantly surprised by the number of cycle paths in Calgary. But I think broadly, you pick up with Professor Lawton's point. I think that's right. The less we can use fuel, the better. I think from the UK perspective, we've been investing quite heavily into this as well in relation to putting money into initiatives to help support healthier lifestyles, reducing reliance on your own transportation, and of course that has lots of other benefits as well in relation to health and well-being, and that tangible impact of smoke and things like that. Of course there was the famous photos of the mountains behind, I think it was New Delhi, wasn't it, which hadn't been seen for about 30 or 40 years until the pandemic had shut down economic activity. As a real stark reminder, I think there's quite a number of those that really show some of those other impacts.
Yeah, and it's so changing our modes of transportation is one thing, but what about changing the fuels that we use? So I'm thinking of biofuels and the composition of the fuels that we've been using to decrease emissions. Dr. Lawton, how realistic is that? Well, how much of an impact can that have, I guess?
I think it'll have a big impact, and I think here in Western Canada we're seeing a lot of interest in hydrogen, and particularly for the transportation sector, for heavy trucks and rail. That's hugely important, I think, provided you can produce the hydrogen without a carbon footprint. And for blue hydrogen, that becomes an issue for dealing with you can't have a blue hydrogen strategy without a CO2 strategy, and I think that's being developed by the province currently. And I think the UK just came out with a hydrogen strategy as well, but Jonathan could probably fill us in on that.
Yeah, we did maybe 3 or 4 weeks ago a new strategy to look at how we can bring all the elements together for hydrogen strategy, and as you mentioned, Dr. Lawson, the key is, of course, that you have to make sure that that reduces your emissions and that it's done in the right way. And of course, you have to get past some of the technical challenges that are required and some of the costs of potentially retrofitting to be able to use hydrogen in homes. And of course, that's something that's been mentioned to me a number of times here. I haven't yet experienced it, but of course, the winters here are pretty cold, so you have to find a way of doing that and heating your homes in a way that you're not having an impact on in terms of carbon reductions. But it's well worth a look at the UK's hydrogen strategy. We've seen a real increase in the investment into that sector, and as I mentioned before, we've got the hubs approach, thinking about how we can bring in these sectors, looking at CCUS as part of that, and of course hydrogen being the ultimate goal and the real winner.
We have 3 questions left from the video questions that have been submitted, so we'll go to the next one.
Hello from Calgary, I'm Megan. I have a young family and I'd like to know what we could do to make a difference. How do we fit into all of this?
A lot of the changes we need to see are systemic. So there are individual actions we can take: ride our bicycle, put solar panels on our roof if we can afford it, and so forth. But I actually think this is an area where government and markets and so forth are really necessary to see these big changes in transportation and energy and so forth. And so I personally think one of the best things you can do is get involved politically, write your leaders, press for more action, faster action. So we have that systemic change that we need to move climate action forward.
What about changing consumption patterns? Just generally speaking, as consumers, we generate, everything we do every day takes energy. So do we think about how we decrease that energy consumption? And is it as simple as what we consume and how we consume it, whether it's goods, services?
Well, I think the pandemic has actually addressed that to some extent, because I think we'll see far less business travel. Now it's going to be hybrid systems of meetings rather than having to fly to the UK for every meeting. You can do half of them by online video. So I think that's one outcome that I think has changed human behavior, and that's really what it comes down to.
Jonathan?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right. I mean, sort of agree with both comments before. There's a systemic issue, and then of course there's a bit of individual responsibility, and actually understanding where your biggest climate impact is, and trying to do what you can to minimize that. And sometimes that's an acceptance that there's going to be some inconvenience into your life that you didn't have before, be it, as Dr. Lawton said, not flying to places in the same way, or taking different transportation, or changing the food that you eat to minimize consumption of items that have a bigger climate impact. But I think understanding that and really having a good grasp, and then trying to make those changes, maybe the easiest ones first, and then start building up.
Yeah. Okay, next question is from Whitehorse.
Hi, Brooke from Whitehorse here. I think this question is best suited for Anna Maria. I'm wondering, what is governance, and what are the benchmarks of good environmental governance?
That's a great question. So yes, I would call faculty in law as part of governance, but it doesn't just include formal laws. It can be all sorts of mechanisms that we employ, institutions, incentives to achieve certain outcomes that we want. And so when we talk about principles of good environmental governance, one of the areas we look at are ideas of transparency, so access to information about the environment, so that people have the means to weigh in, for example, in political matters. and issues of environmental governance, participation, a right of participation in decisions that might affect you in relation to environment, right of access to remedies, so access to the courts, for example, on certain environmental issues. There's also quality of life issues. So we talk about the right to a clean environment, and so we're talking about substantive measures about air quality, clean water, and so forth. So it's obviously complex. I think probably you need a political scientist to answer this question really properly. Law is a piece of it for sure, though.
Yeah. Jonathan, do you have anything you could add to that conversation? Benchmarks of good environmental governance that encourages investment and progress, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I think benchmarking sort of common set of standards is really important, and then that's the starting point, isn't it? You're able to all start from the same page. So I think that's one of the biggest areas. So that's important on that governance side, and then that gives the confidence, which of course is one of the issues, is around how you foster the confidence that that businesses are reducing their emissions, or they're taking that approach.
I guess I would add one more, which is accountability. So we've seen this move of, like, for example, making declarations, net zero declarations by various corporations, civil society groups, and government. One of the questions is whether these net zero pledges are credible. And so a big piece of that is not just making the information available and so forth, but actually following through and doing what you say you'll do. And so accountability, I think, is an issue.
Yeah. Dr. Lawton?
Yeah, I think it also gets back to this, the election cycle, the 4-year term, that governments are sometimes reluctant to bring in, what are required measures because that election cycle time is relatively short.
Yeah. Yeah, not as short as, like I said, the quarterly reporting cycle, but it is 5 years is not enough to make the progress that we actually need to do, and it needs to be, it's a marathon, it's not a sprint. Our next question and our last question comes from Cochrane.
Hi, Lindsay from Cochrane. Jonathan Turner, welcome to Western Canada. I'm curious to know what goes into hosting such an important event like COP26. I would assume there's many environmental friendly aspects in place for these meetings.
Jonathan, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much. Yeah, I mean, I think that's of course one of the challenges with an international conference like this, which is that inevitably it requires everyone to fly there. And I think there's still a very strong argument for having people in the room together to hash out and negotiate a good outcome. And unfortunately, I don't think we found a way around that yet for such a monumental thing such as this. I think what we've done as the host country is to try and be as sustainable as we can in relation to the development, implementation and management of the event, and my understanding is that there's a plan in place which is in line with one of the ISO measures to make sure that we minimise the impact from a sustainability perspective. I know there's a number of different ways in which they're approaching this, including offsetting carbon emissions, using public transport infrastructure where we can, and using ultra low emission vehicles, and I think it's the same through all the major sustainability impacts, be it energy and water consumption, be it some of the materials, and of course the catering as well. So yeah, we wouldn't be doing very well if we weren't looking at that quite closely as we try and deliver this thing, and that's our broad plan.
Well, I think for the first time, the world is going to be very focused on the outcomes of COP26. I think we had other COP events have not had the same level of attention that this one is going to have for so many reasons, and part of them being the climate issues that we've been experiencing in real time, especially in the last 12 months. So that's the end of our questions. And I just want to mention that a group of transdisciplinary scholars and administration at the University of Calgary have been meeting regularly to discuss the opportunity and deliver a series of quality events that support our overall strategic discussion in the lead into COP26. And I encourage everyone to check out the website you see on the screen to get more information, learn about other projects and initiatives, and more UCalgary events leading up to COP26. Other events will include Dr. Lawton participating in a technical webinar entitled Carbon Storage in the Geosphere on Thursday, September 23rd at 8 in the morning. Coffee will not be provided. On September 29th, the University of Calgary President Ed McCauley will lead a discussion on thriving cities. So we're just about out of time, and I'd like to thank Jonathan Turner, Anna Maria Hubert, and Dr. Don Lawton for being with us today and being part of this very important discussion. I know we could have gone on much longer and talked about definitely a number of issues in addition to what we've already highlighted. So everyone who registered for this webinar will receive an email with a link to review the session on demand. And if you enjoyed our discussion, I encourage you to visit ucalgary.ca/community, where you will find more webinars, podcasts, and stories on topics that matter to you. Thanks, everyone. See you next time.